got a really great show for you tonight. And as you see, we've got two authors. We brought in Kelly Morningstar. I'll give a little bit more of an update on him later. And then our very own Jim Sudmeier, all about the topic of Patton. Endless discussion about Patton. So tonight, when we leave, you will already have affirmed what Patton is. Is he a madman? Is he really nuts? Is he a battlefield genius? Or is he all of those things wrapped in a Pearson salted nut roll? My spiritual affair with Patton started in 1970. Like many young people in my hometown, my dad grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and pulled me to the State Theater, downtown Windham, Minnesota. The State Theater packed. A lot of my classmates and their dads were there. As soon as I saw the big American flag go up, I was spellbound. I didn't ask my dad for candy or pop or popcorn. I was enthralled with the portrayal by George C. Scott of Patton. So much so that when I got home after the 2.5, 3 hour movie, I started reenacting some of the combat scenes and trying some of the lines out on my mom. Now, my mom was not too impressed with this and had a closed-door discussion with my dad, but this was my first impression of Patton, and I was smitten. Now, fast forward to the 80s. I'm in college, University of Minnesota, and I'm reading about Patton, studying Patton. I'm in ROTC. I want to be the best of the best, be all you can be, and so I selected to be an armor officer. And so studying Patton, one of the things you find out about Patton is he's kind of an arrogant SOB, yet he is a thinking guy. And one of the key things that we discovered about him is that he thought about things and he planned things, and he realized that there's an exigency in doing things immediately and quickly when you see the ground, or you have the Fingerspitzgefühl. When you can touch things, you can move things. And he saw that there was a lot of energy. And for a guy that's going to sit on top of a 70-ton rolled homogeneous steel tank, dealing death and destruction to nasty communists coming across the North German plain, there's nothing better than having that. So my affair with the Patton concept started then, continued through my service in the military, and to this day we'll see if someone can poke holes in it or not. So let's go to our first author here, Kelly Morningstar. We brought Kelly in from the great state of Maryland. Kelly is a guy after my own heart in the sense of he served in the Army, full career, armor officer. We tread a lot of the same ground together. We never had met until he flew in. West Point graduate, and then following his military career, he just was curious and started picking up degrees and decided to write about Patton. And of course, as an armor guy, and a guy that served in the 37th Armored Regiment, which he has no slack as a 3rd Battalion guy, that was Creighton Abrams Regiment. So he was Thunderbolt 6, of course, during World War II, 4th Armored Division, did a lot of death and destruction on Patton's behalf, and of course, a great legacy there. So as I go forward in this introduction and bring Kelly up, Kelly, you're a brother from another mother. Move out, tanker. Let's give him a round of applause.
I've been invited here to speak to you today about the complex nature of General George S. Patton, Jr. Now, I've come to have some understanding of the man from my years of research for this book, Patton's Way, A Radical Theory of War. But let me begin by saying that if I was looking for a role model for being a husband, a father, a neighbor, or even a mother's son, I probably would look elsewhere. I also have no doubt that Patton exhibited the narcissistic characteristics that Jim will tell you about in his excellent research. All right, as any dictionary will tell you, to categorize someone as nuts is to say that they're crazy or insane, which the law defines as having a mental illness of such severe nature that a person cannot distinguish fantasy from reality, cannot conduct his affairs due to psychosis, or is subject to uncontrollable impulsive behavior. despite all his flaws, the Patton I have come to know was not insane. And while I believe that few, if any of us, can hope that posterity will judge all of our life's actions as sensible, I believe that Patton governed his military career with deliberate calculation. Through careful study and practical experiment, he rejected the accepted practices of his profession as unsuited to the evolving realities of modern war. And instead, he deliberately embraced radical principles of war. And, like most people who adapt radical principles and succeed, he simultaneously confused and irritated observers. My book details 4 radical tenets that constituted his style of warfare. 1, a reliance on shock, targeting the enemy's will, rather than blunt force to destroy enemy forces. 2, exploitation of combined arms, mechanized maneuver, rather than infantry-focused operations. 3, the use of flexible mission orders, command and control instead of rigid, detailed, top-down planning and control. And 4, the employment of synthesized and layered intelligence systems to steer unfolding operations. Each of these tenets resulted from decades of purposeful study, theorization, and field testing, and each broke with established U.S. Army doctrine. Consider the example of shock. Instead of following the established doctrine and shaping operations so as to create decisive battles, Patton sought to unbalance the enemy through shock. That is, to sustain rapid changes in position that threaten the enemy. In other words, instead of using maneuver to mass firepower to wear down the enemy's numbers, Patton used firepower to enable maneuver so as to continuously surprise the enemy with threatening advances. In this way, he deliberately embraced the chaos of war, something that his peers would avoid at all costs. While they sought to bring order to chaos through detailed plans and strict command and control, Patton sought to exploit opportunities that naturally arose in chaotic conditions. During his breakout from Normandy, for example, his aide Charles Codman explained, General Patton felt that this was the time to make an all-out effort by using highly mobile units, widely separated, moving in every direction. He was convinced that we could create such confusion in the German rear that they, having practically no communications, would eventually find themselves in a state of chaos. So, at the time, Patton was deliberately investing in chaos. With his agile intelligence systems, practiced mission orders procedures, and well-trained combined arms columns, Patton was confident that he could exploit the conditions of chaos faster than his enemy could react. And he did. When the Germans attacked the city of Mortain, Patton was ready to encircle them before being ordered to halt. When the Germans escaped the Falaise Gap, Patton was ready to cut them off before being ordered not to. In the end, he went ahead and raced on to the German border, his main mission, until his higher command cut off his gas. Now, each maneuver would have shocked and frustrated the enemy and their will to fight, but they looked too radical to Patton's peers, and they couldn't understand. See, the Army schools taught them that only to pursue strategies of attrition. As the highly influential General Staff College instructor, Colonel W.K. Naylor, explained in 1922, quote, warfare means fighting, and that war is never won by maneuvering. History shows that the surest way to take the fighting spirit out of a country is to defeat his main army. In other words, don't worry about trying to outmaneuver the enemy, just find them and pile on. Accordingly, after cutting off Patton's gasoline in France in the fall of 1944, Eisenhower announced, the plan of battle is as follows. The enemy is stretched to the breaking point, straining every nerve to stave off defeat. We propose to keep on hitting him at every sensitive point until he cracks. He's bound to crack if we keep on hammering him without let up. This was Ike's broad front strategy. Bradley was of the same mind. As fall turned to winter and the snow and the casualties piled up, he waged what he called, quote, sheer butchery around the city of Aachen and Hürtgen Forest. But that was okay, for Bradley believed, like Eisenhower, the daily enemy losses were double our own. From his experience in World War I and his studies afterwards, Patton became convinced that this was too costly in lives. He therefore proposed a new calculus of war, sustaining shock through maneuver to frustrate the enemy's decision-making, erode their morale, and collapse their will. This, he said, would cost fewer lives, and his campaigns bore him out. On this slide, you'll see that, and I know it's detailed, but in comparison with Hodges' First Army, Patton's infantry suffered 4% fewer wounded, 6% fewer deaths. But his tankers suffered remarkably 33% fewer wounded and 43% fewer deaths. Now, if you think long enough about this, you come to conclusions right out of Joseph Heller's book, Catch-22. The sane people were the ones who followed accepted practices that spent their men's lives freely as long as they appeared to purchase more enemy dead in the process. The one who broke with that practice to save lives became something of a heretic whose sanity has since been questioned. Beyond the reductions in casualties, Patton's divergent way of war also delivered victories. And without him, the Allies struggled. In Africa, Eisenhower failed to beat the Germans to Tunisia, and then he suffered disastrous defeat at Kasserine Pass. The Allies slogged their way into Tunis. Montgomery got stuck in Sicily. Mark Clark repeatedly faltered in Italy. Bradley and Montgomery faced stalemate in Normandy. Montgomery failed in Operation Market Garden. Bradley got stuck in the meat grinders at Aachen and Hürtgen Forest before being caught catastrophically flat-footed by the German attack out of the Ardennes. Eisenhower had repeatedly sidelined Patton during most of these periods, only to turn to him during such crises. After each of the two greatest reversals under his command, Kasserine Pass and the Battle of the Bulge, Patton became Ike's one-man fire brigade. It is no wonder he described Patton as one of his guarantors of victory, even if he didn't understand his methods. Still, Patton's methods also confused most observers. As Bradley noted during the pre-war Louisiana maneuvers, Patton broke all the old-fashioned rules, smashing his mechanized forces ever onward with dazzling speed and surprise. Yet he was criticized by the umpire generals for his unorthodoxy. To umpires, Patton's use of intelligence and maneuver to exploit weak spots were judged to be unwillingness to grapple with the enemy. His use of tanks indicated an inability to properly employ infantry. His reliance on mission orders looked like a lack of command and control. His speed of movement was termed rashness, etc., etc., etc. General Leslie McNair even pronounced, quote, "This is no way to fight a war." Such misunderstanding continued during the war. In his memoirs, Bradley complained, quote, "Patton did not give a damn about planning details, and his attitude was reflected by his staff." This opinion was later echoed by historians. But when Patton pushed 200,000 men and 40,000 vehicles through the narrow neck at Avranches in June 1944, Bradley marveled. Every manual on road movement was ground into the dust, and he and his staff did what the whole world knew couldn't be done. It was flat impossible, yet out of the other end of the straw came divisions, intact and ready to fight. If anybody else could have done it, nobody ever got that man's name. Patton, of course, surpassed himself in this maneuver when he maneuvered to defeat the Germans in the Battle of the Bulge. Now, you might ask if Bradley, his peers, and historians would pause to think, how could anyone accomplish such maneuvers without paying adequate attention to detail? The answer is they couldn't. Likewise, Patton's peers and historians have often misattributed his success to clairvoyance or luck. His staff knew better. Patton, twice a division intelligence officer, constructed an unparalleled intelligence system that included innovative air and ground reconnaissance, unique incorporation of ultra-signals intelligence, and Patton's personal interrogation of free French guerrillas and all captured German generals. With this system, Patton knew what he was doing. His G2, Oscar Koch, further explained, "Many times the question has been asked whether Patton possessed an intuition, a sixth sense or whatever, which contributed to the exploits of his commands and to his ability to catch the enemy unaware. If one can call anticipation of the enemy reactions based on a lifetime of professional training and on thinking and application, intuition, he had it." The most famous example of Patton's supposed clairvoyance was his anticipation of the German attack in the Battle of the Bulge. But as you can see here, it was anticipation born of months of deliberate investigation and analysis. Now, such misperceptions have stood as lasting gifts to Patton's critics. Liddell Hart, Stanley P. Hirschhorn, for example, cited the testimony of Bradley and 4th Armored Division Commander John Wood that Patton had nothing to do with the breakout from Normandy, because the key action, the movement of tanks forward in the 8th Corps, happened before Patton's command was officially stood up. They attributed the decision to lead the armor to the 8th Corps commander, Troy Middleton. But Middleton himself later wrote that the decision was made, quote, "at Patton's direction." Wood likely was unaware of this, but Bradley knew better. Similar skewed perceptions have colored popular misunderstandings of Patton's operations in his 3-day attack in campaigns in Morocco, his limited attacks in Tunisia, his end run in Sicily, and of course his running out of gasoline in France. Now, however, none of this is to say that Patton did not suffer setbacks or make mistakes. All commanders do. His slapping of the hospitalized soldiers was, of course, despicable, especially with what we know today about post-traumatic stress disorders. But the two operational errors his critics routinely focus on are the two errors he publicly admitted. The overly prolonged probing attacks against the fortifications at Metz in the fall of 1944 and the Hamelberg Raid in 1945. Now, militarily, Metz is the more understandable of the two. As Henry Yead calculated, when Patton reached the outskirts of that citadel, his gasoline already cut off. Yead said the Germans could have interposed no coherent military formations on Patton's way. On 1 September, the entire German army had 9 infantry battalions, 2 artillery battalions, 10 anti-tank guns, and 10 tanks blocking Third Army. Patton fruitlessly begged Eisenhower and Bradley for support so that he could blitz the forts while they sat empty. Ike said no, not until the Calais area was stabilized, as you see here on the map. Patton was forced to recall the 2nd Armored Regiment's patrols from east of the Moselle River. Only 48 hours later, German Army Group G had miraculously assembled 106,700 infantry and 78,000 panzer troops, supported by 200,000 reserves in and around the Metz fortifications. Patton did not know this. He continued probing attacks to find a weak spot that no longer existed. By the end of September, he finally admitted the futility of further probes and paused to organize larger, deliberate attacks that isolated the fortresses and finally captured the city on 13 December. To some, the Battle of Metz is evidence that Patton could not fight a set-piece battle, i.e. he was a rash, not a rational commander. But consider that while fighting for this battle on a secondary front with no support, Patton's Third Army captured the citadel at Metz at the cost of 9,000 casualties, while inflicting reported 43,200 casualties on the Germans. And that during that same period, Montgomery, with priority SHAEF support, suffered 17,000 casualties in the failed Market Garden operation, and then another 18,000 casualties in clearing the Scheldt. And that Hodge's First Army slugged through Hürtgen Forest and Aachen at the cost of over 38,000 casualties. And these was with priority efforts. But let's concede for the moment that such comparative analysis is problematic because conditions varied. Well, in his definitive study of Patton at Metz, John Nelson Ricard concluded, when viewed in isolation, Patton's final operations at Metz showed a good deal of skill. He was more than capable of conducting a tedious set-piece attack against a fortified position. In other words, he was a rational commander. Now, the second error, the raid on Hamelberg, was far less understandable. In short, Patton sent 300 men and a task force bomb to liberate 900 POWs in a camp 50 miles behind enemy lines. They liberated the camp but were cut off and destroyed before making it back. 32 men were killed, 256 were captured, including nearly all the freed POWs. The mission itself was risky enough, but Patton compounded it by issuing an impossibly contradictory order, directing Baum to conduct a stealthy raid and a noisy diversion at the same time. Why would he do such a stupid thing? Was he madly seeking glory? No, I don't think so. Reliable intelligence had reported that Hamelberg camp held his son-in-law, Colonel John Walters. Patton decided to risk men's lives out of love for his daughter, Beatrice. Such compassion drove Patton to craft his way of war. He was appalled by the carnage he witnessed during the Great War, and he experienced his own frequent injuries. Here you see a rare picture I dug out of the archives. When he was lieutenant, he was burned badly by a defective oil lamp on a campaign in Mexico in 1916. He was even shot in battle in World War I. How did this affect him? His daughter Ruth Ellen recalled him describing a night reconnaissance in World War I. While crawling across the battlefield, he studied the many fallen soldiers that were laying around him, and he found himself struggling to repress sudden thoughts of their mothers. Suddenly, she said, the whole concept seemed unbearable, and he decided the only way to survive under such stress was to try to think of soldiers as numbers, not as individuals. And that, she said, the sooner the Allies won, the sooner the slaughter of innocents would cease. However, no matter what he said, he could never quite do that, she concluded. To him, men were always individuals, people, responsibility, always. His aide Codman studied Patton closely during World War II, and he observed, quote, "The simple truth of the matter is that all his life, General Patton had been obsessed with an almost neurotic aversion to suffering and cruelty in any and every form. This empathy led Patton to order the populations of the towns nearest to the concentration camps he liberated to tour the camps, treat the inmates, dig their graves, and tend their memorials, as such as seen here. Patton, however, felt duty-bound to hide such personal feelings from his troops and other observers. Patton's lifelong study of great commanders had convinced him of what John Keegan would later argue, that commanders who, quote, carry forward others to the risk of their lives must reveal only as much of themselves as their followers required. All else had to be concealed behind a mask of command. Patton's mask included a consciously constructed gaudy costume of polished helmets, riding breeches, ivory-handled pistols, a uniform designed purposefully to motivate a generation of young recruits who were reared on dime store novels and comic books. Yet, as a 1941 Life magazine cover story reported, the costume earned him the nicknames General Flash Gordon and the Green Hornet. The soldiers, who tend to be skeptical of commanders in general and of flashy commanders in particular, loved Patton. As one officer in Tunisia wrote, "The old soldiers who knew him as Gorgeous Georgie or Flash Gordon rejoiced at his coming. Even though they feared his rashness, they knew he would demand much, but that there would always be a pat on the back for every kick in the pants, and that their interest would be his interest." The archives and memoirs that I covered for 15 years were filled with such statements. While visiting wounded American soldiers in British hospitals, Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson, no fan of old blood and guts, noted with surprise, when asking a patient what unit he was in, men from other armies invariably named their regiment or division, very few knowing what army they were in or the name of the commanding general. But a Third Army man always replied, "I was with Third Army," and he not only knew who commanded it, but he usually had a personal anecdote about Patton. I believe this was not because of Patton's persona, but rather because of his success. As the major explained, "I knew I was with a winner." He had the reputation of being a winner from Africa and Sicily. In the popular mind, however, this reputation became one with his appearance. A Navy lieutenant recalled that upon seeing Patton, you get the same feeling as when you saw Babe Ruth striding up to the plate. Here's a big guy who's going to kick the hell out of something. Few, however, had the opportunity to separate the man from the character. Patton's stenographer, Corporal Joe Rossovich, was one of those. He first saw Patton clad in slippers and wearing pince-nez glasses as he thoughtfully drafted his speech before rehearsing it with purple fury. Patton then paused and looked at Rossovich. He said that the performance we had just watched was exactly that, a performance, a put-up show, calculated and rehearsed act of bravado. He was convinced, he said, that the young men of America needed such toughening because they had grown soft. You have to shock them out of their ordinary habits of thinking with the kind of language you just heard in his speech. Rossovich added, "I had the occasion to see that I was serving two men rather than one. General Patton was the fusion of two men who lived in different worlds. One was his own world of calm efficiency, discipline, and order. The other was a world of his immediate environment, our world of extreme tension and nervous strain." Bradley, for one, recognized Patton as, quote, an actor. Almost everything he did was designed to create a dramatic effect. 10 years before the war, Patton explained in an article, "A cold reserve cannot beget enthusiasm. It then appears that a leader must be an actor." His act included the stage outburst of anger, scripted in the language of the barracks. He wrote, "The greatest gift a general can have is a bad temper, under control. A bad temper gives you a sort of divine wrath, and is only by the use of divine wrath that you can drive men beyond their physical ability in order to save their lives." Now, of course, it was sometimes hard to keep that under control. The act inevitably attracted criticisms. Eisenhower wrote, "He talks too much and too quickly and sometimes creates a very bad impression. Moreover, I fear he's not always a good example to his subordinates, who may be guided by only his surface actions without understanding the deep sense of duty, courage, and service that made up his real personality." George Marshall once said, "Patton was not only indiscreet, he descended to almost buffoonery at times." Doctors and war correspondents frankly despised the image of Patton and projected their feelings on others. Andy Rooney, for example, wrote, Many of the soldiers in Patton's army hated him. He was a loudmouth bore who got too many American soldiers killed for the sake of enhancing his own reputation as a swashbuckling leader in the Napoleonic style. He couldn't have been more wrong. Patton, in fact, recognized his critics and admitted, "I have somewhat of an impish nature and frequently like to shock people. In fact, I've shocked so many people so efficiently that it has militated against my success." In time, however, Patton's image largely eclipsed the man. Close associate General Albert Wiedemeyer explained, "The American people were given a picture of him only as a swashbuckling, intrepid combat leader, but he had a scholarly bent and a profound knowledge of strategy, tactics, military, and political techniques." This, then, is the nature, the complex nature of George Patton, is a duality of costume and genius, providing fodder for critics and grist for students. At the one extreme, British author Charles Whiting wrote, "In essence, Patton was neither a great man nor a great soldier. If he had not lived, it would not have mattered one little bit. Nor was he a great captain. He initiated no new tactics such as Guderian's and von Manstein's concept of Blitzkrieg." It was that paragraph that sent me on a 15-year mission writing my book.
Amen, brother.
As a career Army officer and a military historian, I beg to differ with Mr. Whiting. Patton's record, even if overshadowed by his character, was historically significant, both as a great captain and a theorist. In my book, I examine the Army Patton lived in, the doctrine he was told to follow, what he thought and wrote about that doctrine, how he challenged it in his actions in peace and war. From these pieces, I reassembled his way of war, analyzed it in practice, scrutinized its legacy. In the end, I found Patton to be a thoughtful, deliberate man who constructed and practiced a radical and advanced form of warfare, often in conflict with his peers and superiors who could not see the method behind the image. Thank you very much.
Now we've got Dr. James Sudmeier. Jim is one of our members on the board for the World War II Roundtable. And Don Patton, our glorious leader, in his infinite wisdom, came up with this idea of, let's do bookends on Patton. Some people really think he's great. Some people think he's nuts. Let's have a great debate. And then we said, well, let's have a discussion. Let's be Minnesota nice, passive aggressive. We'll do some stuff like that. So with our own James Sudmeier, a Minneapolis native, been around the country packing up degrees, PhD chemistry from Princeton, and he's also a screenwriter. He likes movies, and he writes movies. He's, in fact, working on one right now. I'm going to spill the beans a little bit for you, about Brothers in Armor. And it's about the 4th Armored Division, that special relationship between Creighton Abrams and Cohen, which had a rocky start, but a couple of guys that figured out how to be in combat together and carrying forward and reading each other's minds and being successful, taking care of their troops, taking care of their equipment, and getting to ultimate victory. Now, the one thing that became very apparent to me with Jim and looking at his book and studying his face is I think he's the long-lost brother of our own Steve Daubenspec. So afterwards, we may just have, do one of those kind of things, and you guys can, see if they're related or not. But with no further ado, I'm going to bring up James, and he's going to talk about his book, Patton's Madness: The Dark Side of Genius. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Mark, for your very kind introduction. Today I want to talk to you about my book, which came out 5 years ago, originally in paperback. Today I believe it's more relevant than ever. First of all, I'd like to take a brief survey. How many of you have seen the movie Patton? Almost everybody. The image of Patton is amazing. When the movie first came out, at least I saw the movie at least 3 times when it first came out. I had a bad case of hero worship. There's a lot to like in the Patton image. The man is powerful, forceful, flamboyant, charismatic, witty. He looks really good in his tailor-made uniforms and expensive boots. On the home front, he was inspiring, a morale builder in those dark days of World War II. He was the American general most feared by the Germans, our best broken field runner, our best at combined arms, the American Blitzkrieg, which my colleague Kelly Morningstar has described so very well. But sometimes the reality does not hold up to the image. For example, Patton's voice. I wonder how many of you have actually heard the great general's voice. I'm going to play for you one of the few remaining film clips with his voice.
We're not just going to shoot the bastards. We're going to cut out their living guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks. We're going to murder those lousy Hun bastards by the bushel.
That's the gravel voice of George C. Scott. Now here comes Patton.
You must remember this, that from Brest to various towns in southern Germany and Austria, whose names I can't pronounce, but whose places I have removed.
His high-pitched, almost squeaky voice, Patton tried to compensate by the use of excess profanity and various macho behaviors. How did Patton's colleagues and biographers regard him? General Eisenhower, in a letter to General George C. Marshall, described Patton as my mentally unbalanced general. World War I historian Lengel described Patton as brilliantly insane. His principal biographers, Blumenson and D'Este, diagnosed him as dyslexic, having a reading disorder, although as soon as Patton learned to read at age 12, having been homeschooled, he became a voracious reader. Martin Blumenson also suggested that he had ADD, attention deficit disorder, although he focused like a laser on his studies, especially military history. Dan Crosswell, who spoke here last year, diagnosed Patton with bipolar disorder, what we used to call manic depressive. But there were good reasons for Patton's up and down mood swings, not the sudden randomness of bipolar disorder. Patton's grandson, Jim Totten, suggested to me that it was all about his repeated brain injuries, of which there were many, and ironically, PTSD, a disease that Patton never believed in. All these are guesswork, non-scientific diagnoses. I wanted to get beneath the Patton image and find out what makes him tick. I read everything there is on Patton to try to discover this. His personality development, starting in his first 3 years, is the key to his performance as a leader and a general in later life. Mine is the first and only scientific diagnosis of Patton, making use of the psychiatrist's Bible, the DSM-5. Now, what is the DSM-5? It is a very thick book cataloging all known mental disorders and personality disorders with a set of categories for each. By the way, personality disorders are people who know reality when they see it. To diagnose, sometimes it's just as simple as checking the boxes. This highly respected book is a consensus of thousands of psychiatrists, psychologists, and psychoanalysts, and is constantly updated and revised. Patton's upbringing was dominated by memories of his grandfather, Colonel George Patton I, and his great-uncle, Colonel Tazewell. Both were graduates of Virginia Military Institute, VMI, the West Point of the South. Both died of wounds received while fighting heroically for the South in the Civil War. Young George's father, George Patton II, also attended VMI, where he was valedictorian, but had no wars to fight in his time, which disappointed the family. Young George Patton III vowed to save the family honor. Now, out in California, where he lived, Ruth and Annie Wilson had money. The huge ranch and vineyard they lived on near present-day Pasadena stretched all the way from Santa Monica to Riverside. At a dance, George Patton II met Annie Wilson, the eldest daughter of Benjamin Wilson, a one-time mayor of Los Angeles. Annie introduced him to her younger sister, Ruth. Before long, Patton decided to marry Ruth. Annie was bitter and never got over it. After the marriage, George II joined the sisters living in the ranch house, and when the baby they called Georgie came along, Aunt Annie played an increasing role in his mothering, much to Ruth's chagrin. Arrival of a baby sister when Georgie was 21 months old allowed Ruth to surrender the boy to the keep of her sister Annie, leaving the boy feeling abandoned. Georgie soon became what I call in the book the spoiledest boy in the world. With a 1,300-acre ranch, he had a choice of 100 ponies. He had 3 parents doting on him and was never disciplined because he learned how to play one parent off against the other. Aunt Annie thought that Georgie was too delicate to go to school, and thus he was homeschooled until age 11. Georgie never learned the rough and tumble of playing with other boys, and never in his life had a best buddy. His father and his aunt read to him daily about Napoleon, Frederick the Great, Alexander the Great. They read from Homer, they read from the Bible, all the great literature classics, mostly military history, and stories of his own ancestors' glory. Aunt Annie also taught him to believe in reincarnation. Georgie vowed, starting at age 8, that his mission in life was to rescue the family tradition by dying in battle a hero's death, which he did not fear, and he never wavered from that ambition. He had some trouble in West Point. It took him 5 years because he flunked mathematics instead of 4. But after graduating from West Point, Patton realized that for his career he would need big money. And the easiest way to get that was, like his father, to marry a rich girl. Over her father's objections, he married Beatrice Ayer, a wealthy heiress from Boston. When they got married in 1910, they were worth about $50 million in today's money. They joined high society's horsey set, the fox hunters and the polo players. They hung out with actresses and celebrities and royalty. Patton was the richest officer in the U.S. Army. He flaunted his wealth, giving him a big advantage over his fellow officers. He was able to say and do outrageous things and take more risks than anybody else because he didn't need the money. Now, any of you who have served in the military know that brown-nosing or bootlicking, seeking special favors from superior officers, is strictly taboo. Patton, the people user, freely brown-nosed anybody who could help him, and he got away with it. General George Pershing, the top commander in the 1915 Mexican expedition and in World War I, became his first target. Patton very quickly became his aide, and they went for long rides in the Mexican desert together. He even introduced Pershing to his sister Nita, a tall, auburn-haired beauty, and they became romantically involved. Patton got promoted very quickly to colonel in World War I and got special treatment because of his connections with the top brass. Patton cultivated every new Army chief of staff that came along, like General George C. Marshall. Patton told him, "You can come live in my house until you get settled. You can ride my horses, play with my squash court," and that's what happened. You'd think that when Patton married the wealthy Beatrice, he would have been very careful about his marriage vows. That was not the case. Jean Gordon, 30 years younger than Patton, was the half-niece of his wife. Jean was a debutante, spoke French fluently, lost her dad at an early age, and vacationed with the Patton family. In Hawaii in 1935, right under Beatrice's nose, the affair with Patton started and continued for the rest of both of their lives. While Jean was in Europe with Patton during the war as a Red Cross donut girl, Beatrice had to stay home. After Patton's death, Beatrice had a bitter confrontation with Jean. A few days later, in a New York apartment, wearing a negligee and surrounded by photos of Patton, Jean committed suicide using natural gas from the kitchen stove. Patton was famous for dumping on subordinates. He sent a letter to his wife during World War I saying, "I think I killed one man here. He would not work, so I hit him over the head with a shovel." This statement was recorded by his principal biographers, Blumenson and D'Esta, but without any comment. It happened on the same day that Patton was severely wounded with a gunshot and was flat on his back for the next 3 months. So nothing ever came of it. If the incident were untrue, it's hard to believe that Patton would have bragged about it because it could have ended his career. Of course, most of you know from the movie about the slapping incident. Patton labeled as cowards men suffering from what we now recognize as PTSD. Actually, there were 2 incidents a week apart in Sicily. The first soldier slapped, Private Cool, turned out to be suffering from malaria. Later on, he recovered, invaded Omaha Beach with Big Red 1 Division, and survived the war. To his dying day, Patton never regretted these slapping incidents. Here's an example of the abuse of a subordinate officer. And there were many in my book. There are 4 or 5 other examples. Major General Terry Allen was tough as nails, shot in the face in World War I, a great fighter, and beloved by his men. In North Africa, the Germans had air superiority. Patton visited Allen one day and saw some slit trenches. He asked, "Which one is yours?" And Allen pointed one out. Patton went over and urinated on it. "Now try using it," he said. Allen's bodyguards unclicked the safeties of their submachine guns. Patton heard this and wasted no time leaving. Here's my question. Why did a great man like Patton have to dump on people like this? Is this effective military leadership? I've read some of the books on management, Dale Carnegie, Tom Peters, and so forth. If you were running a hardware store, let's say, is that how you would treat your employees? Humiliating, belittling, degrading them? Would that lead to better performance? I don't think so. Or did this behavior point to some basic insecurity in Patton's psyche? Now, Patton has a reputation for being a brilliant strategist. How did he live up to this reputation? In open field with disorganized enemy, he was magnificent. As he blitzed some 500 miles across France, also the next spring during the Palatinate campaign, my colleague Kelly Morningstar focused on this in his book, which is sure to become the authoritative source on Patton's method of war. The liberation of Bastogne, halting the German surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, and rescuing the surrounded 101st Airborne, I think most people agree was his finest moment, to which I devoted an entire chapter in my book. He anticipated it using some of his own intelligence sources, as my colleague has said. He planned for various contingencies. He organized logistics on a massive scale. For example, commandeered a freight train to bring all the Third Army supplies 140 miles north. But there were other cases he didn't do that well. For example, when he came up against the hardened defenses like Fort Driant, the most impregnable fortress in all of Europe. As my colleague mentioned, for weeks he kept banging up against the fortifications. This resulted in hundreds of his men killed. Eventually he bypassed it, but could have done so a lot sooner, except for his ego, which compelled him to try and conquer the legendary fortress. There were other times when he used poor judgment, wasting blood and treasure, the most famous being the Hamelberg Raid, in which 25 of the raiders and an unknown number of prisoners were killed and 245 raiders taken prisoner in a misguided attempt by Patton to liberate his son-in-law from a German prison camp. But there was one battle, not as well known, at Brolo in Sicily, which I'm going to talk about today. In Sicily, you have Syracuse on the lower right, and that's where Field Marshal Montgomery and all the British forces land. The Americans came in around the area around Gela. The goal was to destroy the German and Italian forces before they escaped to mainland Italy through the Straits of Messina. Monty's attack bogged down behind the 11,000-foot volcano, Mount Etna, and Patton made a beeline for the capital city of Palermo, where he not only got a hero's welcome, he got access to a deep water port. However, now to beat Montgomery to Messina, All this ground was mountainous, some mountains as high as 4,000 feet, cut by deep river valleys, perfect for defense. The Germans had blown all the bridges and tunnels and mined all the roads and beaches. The job was going to be up and over the mountains, carrying all the ammunition, food, and water with some 400 packed burros and horses. Some of the trails were so steep that animals slipped and fell to their deaths. Now, Major General Lucien Truscott II and his elite 3rd Infantry Division were very well suited for this job. Why? His men were conditioned to run 4 to 5 miles an hour with full packs, double that of regular infantry. They were fighting in the August heat, mostly at night, and malaria running rampant. The division got stuck for days behind the enemy's defense of 2,200-foot Mount San Fratello. So Truscott decided that his men would make an amphibious end run around this choke point using about a dozen U.S. naval landing craft. The amphibious double pincer would require precise timing to bring together the land and sea forces at the same instant. Truscott's timing was superb, leading to the capture of 1,600 enemy soldiers right here. A couple days later, the Americans were stuck behind Nassau Ridge. This gave Patton to do another amphibious end run. He also saw an opening for some publicity by bringing along a half dozen top war correspondents riding in the ships to witness the double pincer. The only trouble was Patton's timing turned out to be faulty. Here via Google Earth, you can see the landing place, Patton's end run. The 900-foot mountain here, called Monte Cipollo, or in English, Mount Onion. The village to the left here is Brolo, and over here you can see Nassau Ridge, where the Americans were fighting their way towards Brolo and Messina. About 3 o'clock in the morning, this is where the sea forces came in, the 650 soldiers of Task Force Bernard, plus reporters. They expected to see the American land forces fighting the German troops retreating leftward towards Messina. When nobody was there, the Americans took the high ground. Soon they were discovered by the enemy, and for the next 24 hours, the attackers became the targets. Now you can see on the back of Cipollo Peak, there's a road, and there are some trails, switchbacks and so forth, leading to the top. My wife and I were there a couple years ago and decided to try and climb to the top. We went about halfway up the road and discovered that it was blocked by a fence. Here we are. We walked up this path to Monte Cipollo. One battalion that came in on amphibious ships. They had some tanks, they had some artillery, and they were supposed to meet with Truscott's 3rd Infantry Division right in Brolo and cut off the Germans who were all trying to go east to Messina. He thought that Truscott could get here in fighting their way up Nassau Ridge and so forth, which is very tough ground. He thought that they should be able to get here in 24 hours. Truscott said, no, it's going to take 48 hours. Well, Patton had already had a 1-day delay because some Germans had shot up some of his LST landing craft. He had to replace that back in Palermo. So he wasn't about to delay any further. And he said, nope, we're going ahead, otherwise I'll find somebody else to replace you. And he said this to the great Lucien Truscott. And so he said, okay, I'll go ahead, I'll give the order. But it turned out to be an absolute disaster. These men from Task Force Bernardo sat up here at night. They were radioing for help. They were getting some fire from naval cruisers offshore. And they were trying to bring him in on the Germans, you know.
1725, Colonel Bernard. Battalion from west counterattacking.
need Navy and Air on 702504 immediately, or we are lost. At one point, they actually got strafed, or 16 guys got killed by an American Air Force. So there was one hell of a battle going on here. And eventually, the Americans came in here, the Germans escaped, and 177 good young American men died needlessly here on this hill. It must be absolutely full of shrapnel and unexploded ammunition. So this place, 75 years later, is still red hot with ammunition that was expended here. It was a disaster. It was one of Patton's worst moves, and it was all because of his ego. And the reporters who came along for the ride were sickened when they saw the carnage the next morning. And Patton just said, "This is great. The American men are the greatest fighters in the world. On to Messina." Narcissus was the handsome young man in Greco-Roman mythology who fell in love with his own reflection in the water until his death, never knowing the love of another human being. Narcissistic personality disorder has 9 criteria in the DSM-5. Number 1 is grandiosity or exaggerated achievements. Number 2, fantasies of success, power, beauty, vanity, which Patton had in abundance. 3, social climbing, need to associate with the upper crust. 4, need for excessive admiration, headlines, publicity. Criterion 5, a sense of entitlement, special treatment, believe that you don't have to obey the same rules as other people. 6, exploitation of others, people user. 7, lack of empathy. Empathy is the ability to feel what it's like to walk in another person's shoes. Number 8, envy of others and feeling that other people are envious in return. And finally, arrogance, snobbishness, racism, feeling superior to other human beings. Now, if you have 5 of these 9 criteria, you have a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. In my opinion, and I give many examples in the book, he's a perfect fit. He meets all 9 of the 9 criteria. He suffered from overt pathological narcissistic personality disorder with, like other NPD sufferers, the emotional maturity of a toddler. Now, what is it like to be a narcissist? You may have known some. Have you ever known somebody who's cocky, conceited, arrogant, stuck up, prima donna, big shot, full of himself? Often he is the funniest, best dressed, best looking, most engaging person in the room. He makes you feel like you don't exist. There are 2 kinds of people he has use for. Those who can pump up his ego because it has to be pumped constantly, and those he can put down. That also helps pump up the ego. He tends to overclaim his victories, overestimates his abilities. He doesn't think about the downside. He thinks about the carrot and not the stick. He's apt to take excessive risks. Any mistakes he made will be blamed on other people. Therefore, he does not learn properly. He is very satisfied with himself. Even though he's making life hell for almost everybody around him, he feels real good about himself. Like Patton, he's not a team player. Someone like Patton had to be kept on a short leash, frequently put on probation by Eisenhower. Patton's biggest errors and scandals occurred when he was not in the doghouse, as shown in Appendix A in my book. What does this diagnosis offer? It means that Patton's irrational behavior becomes rational, easily understood. No longer does he have to be the enigma. We can appreciate him as a fellow human being. What is my take-home lesson? Here's a great quotation by Rick Atkinson that I learned from Morningstar's excellent book. Unlike many, he was comfortable with ambiguity. two contradictory things can both be true at the same time. Likewise, I think we could do with less hero worship and more appreciation of the human being, however flawed he was. The sins of MacArthur, another certified NPD, are offset in the eyes of many by the remarkable job he did rebuilding Japan after the war, making it into a first-rate democracy. Also, I think most of us are willing to forgive any abuses of the great General Patton because of his substantial contribution to winning World War II. I personally like to put more focus on the real heroes, the ordinary foot soldiers, and therefore I dedicated my book to all the dog faces of World War II who lived with the terror of war and without the glory, and to the replacements who performed their duty often without a single buddy. Many, as you know, came into the front lines in the middle of the night. Nobody wanted to befriend them because by the next morning, chances were they'd be dead. And finally, to the combat leaders who made the tough calls and took action, not expecting to be in the history books. They did their jobs. And this especially includes the company commanders, platoon leaders, squad leaders who normally had the highest casualty rates. We'll forever be in their debt. Thank you.
Do we have Ed? And he's up. Oh, look at that. Well, this is Private First Class Dr. Ed Albrecht. He is our World War II vet, and with no further ado, Ed, take it away and tell us about your World War II story. Thank you.
All right, I'm a junior in high school in 1941 when Pearl Harbor was attacked. So that put us in on a war footing, and from then on, I continued with my education. I wanted to get a high school diploma, and so I stayed in school until I graduated. Some of my classmates quit school right away and went and joined the Navy or joined the Marines, but I wanted that high school diploma, and so in March of 44, then or March of 43, I turned 18 years old, registered for the draft, and the draft board delayed me until I graduated from high school, and so after graduation, then I got my draft number, and on July 15th of 1943, then I was inducted into the Army at Fort Snelling. And so I went through the induction process and took the Army General Classification tests. And from that, they determined I should be in the Air Corps. And they sent me to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. And so I started basic training in the Air Corps. And at that time, I took more general classification tests to determine what part of the Air Corps I should be in. And I qualified for meteorology school. And also, when I was at Jefferson Barracks, I made application for the Army Specialized Training Program. And I passed that and got into the ASTP at Fargo, North Dakota. So I was at the University of North Dakota studying a pre-engineering course. The Army wanted engineers, and so that was our course of study. And so we started in about October of 1943. And we continued through the winter until March of 1944. So on the 15th of March, the Army closed down the whole ASTP program, and all these students were sent into various infantry divisions throughout the country. And I was sent to the 42nd Rainbow Division, and it was near Muskogee, Oklahoma. And so then I got to start basic training in with the 42nd Division. And I started out then with 17 weeks of basic infantry training, which carried me to about May. And then after that training, the Army needed replacements for some of their units, and so they took some of the men from the Rainbow Division and shipped them out to various units. And I think being an 18-year-old at that time, it was not being sent to frontline duty, and so we stayed behind. And then, so I had to start infantry training all over. So I took another basic infantry course with the Rainbow Division in K Company this time. And so I was given a BAR for the firepower for the squad. So there's 12 men in a squad, and then you have the BAR man, which represents the firepower. And so I carried the BAR. So the unit weighs about 19 pounds. And then the ammo that you carried was 6 cartridges of 20 shells each. And so you carried that on a belt around your waist. And so you have a 19-pound rifle plus the weight of the ammunition. And then besides that, then you got your canteen of water and some of your other supplies. And so anyhow, we went through basic training, and that took us into the fall of 44. The division got orders then to deploy to the East Coast. And so we had to pack up all our equipment and then ship it to New York. Then we went to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, and after being processed there, we probably got some shots there and and got some equipment and some new clothing. And so then we were at Camp Kilmer there for a few days, and then they did give us a 12-hour pass into New York City. So I got into New York City there, and the Times Square, and I got to the USO building there, and so at the USO, and I got to a telephone. I called my folks, so we had a 3-minute call, and then they had to hang up. So, well, anyhow, we left on the General Black, the whole regiment, about 4,000 men that shipped out of New York City. And so we sailed past the Statue of Liberty, heading out into the ocean. And as soon as we got into out of the port and into the ocean currents, right, the boat started its movement of rocking, and of course, then you started getting this awful feeling and queasy, and so I got seasick for a few days, and then and so we were in a convoy headed for Marseille, France, and so we went through the Straits of Gibraltar and in the Mediterranean, and we left on November 24th, and we got to Marseille, France on December 8th. And we left Marseille and we went out about 10 miles and camped while we're getting things ready to move northward. And we went northward by rail. We were on these rail cars that the French called 40 and 8. So they held 40 men or 8 horses. and we went northward to Strasbourg, and then we were there a few days, and then we were deployed into northwestern France, near into the Hatton area. And this area is a point of France that kind of juts out toward Germany, and it's kind of on a point there. So, so we were there, and the Germans started an attack called Norwind on our lines at Hatton, and the 222nd Regiment was on the front line, and our area, our battalion, and the 242nd were in reserve. So if the Germans broke through, then we would be called up for action to repel the Germans. So, but that didn't happen because the 222nd held their ground there, and the Germans released their attack, and we were we got a rest for a bit. So, but we were on this point in Hatton, and it kind of jutted out where the Germans were on three sides of us. So we pulled back one night, and we made a march on ice-covered, snow-covered roads about 10, 12 miles back toward Haguenau, France. So we set up a defense line on the Moder River. And so after marching all night, we had to dig a foxhole after your feet were so sore you could hardly stand on them, but you still had to dig a foxhole. So we did get through that. And of course, our meals were K rations. And so we had K rations for breakfast and for dinner. And the K rations were mostly the crackers and a little canned meat, a chocolate bar, and some kind of it was some kind of a fruit bar, but it was pretty good. And then at night we did get a hot meal, but well, anyhow, we're on the Moder River, and our first assignment there was to go to a factory building. And so a squad of 12 men that crossed this little bridge over the Moder River, and we went into this factory building for defense. And now the sergeant in charge left me in this area with all these windows. Of course, they're broken out, but all these windows faced a huge open field in front of us. He left me there, and he took the rest of the men to another area in the factory. I don't know where. And I learned out later that those men got captured. But anyhow, I'm in this area then by myself. And then we're looking out on this field, and in the distance we can see this movement, these white-clad figures moving toward us. And of course, they're German soldiers with their army white uniforms. And so they're slowly advancing, and I hear them jabbering with each other in German. And so they get closer, and they got to about, there were 30 yards in front of the building. And then I thought that's close enough. So then I was going to open fire. So I put my rifle up to my shoulder and was going to fire. And of course, it didn't fire, it just clicked. And so I realized at that point I was no good to anybody at that point. And so I I left that area and dashed out the back entrance of that factory, and across that little river, and back to my company lines. And then, so I got back to the company lines, and of course there were several wounded men that we had to leave behind, and so we had to leave them in the basement of a building there. And of course, the captain said, this place is crawling with Germans, we have to get out of here. And so we had to pull back through L Company's lines. And then we got back to a place a little safer. And then the next morning, the L Company attacked this German position where I was in that factory building, and drove them back. And then of course we got to leave the area and got to go back to another town for a rest. And at that point we were able to get a shower and get some new clothes. So we got outfitted in this town, and we spent a little time there. And then it comes into March, coming up to the March 15th is when the big push into Germany to end the war. And so we moved up into a line of departure in that area. On a map, it would have been the Wingen area. And so we were there in the early morning. And we lined up what you call a skirmish line. So we're spread out laterally about 10 yards apart. Well, there was a big artillery barrage on the German lines that we could see the smoke coming up from the explosions. And so that lifted and we started to move out. So we started moving toward the German lines, and we just went for a short while, and we had to stop, and we got a report there were snipers ahead, and we waited, and eventually they got the snipers. And so we started to move forward again. And so we started slowly moving forward, and then all of a sudden I felt a tremendous blow on my back. And I went a few steps further, but I couldn't go on anymore. And so I went down. And a little while later, I woke up, and then here the ground was burning around my feet. So the leaves and the twigs were on fire. And so I had to kind of crawl away from that area. And eventually a medic came, and eventually they got me back to a field hospital. And so I was in this field hospital, and it was full of wounded men laying on cots in the hallways and all over. And so I spent a little time, about a week or so. We finally got into a room and got a cot, and then they put us on penicillin, which would only last 3 hours. So it was new, and it was a new way of treating infection. And so we were on this penicillin for round the clock, every 3 hours. And so we got through that. I can't remember if I was up and walking around or if I just laid in bed all the time. And I can't remember how we got fed there or what, but anyhow, we left there eventually, and they were sent back to Dijon, France, to a general hospital. And so we were, so I was at this general hospital in about a month after I got hit. They did surgery, and I suppose they took some of the shrapnel out, but there's still some in there in the chest. And so I had that surgery, and then I got physical therapy, and they finally they shipped me out. I went to Cherbourg. We got on a hospital ship and to head for the States. And we got out into the English Channel. And of course, I started getting seasick again. And then eventually, after we got our sea legs, and we started, and the trip went pretty good. So we landed in Charleston, South Carolina. And from there, they sent us to Spokane, Washington, where they treated chest injuries. And so I was at Spokane for a while, and then after I had physical therapy and was pretty well healed, they gave me a 3-month delay en route to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. So I got to spend the summer at my home. And then I reported to Camp McCoy in probably September. And then from Camp McCoy, they sent me to Fort Sam Houston in Texas. And I was there a few days, and from there they sent me to Hatch, New Mexico, to guard German prisoners. They were prisoners from the North African campaign. And so we used to take those prisoners, we used to take them out in the cotton fields, and they would pick cotton. So and then, so I was there probably from, I would say, October to March. So in March, my number came up for discharge. And so I was discharged from Fort Bliss. And then I headed for home. And so I got to be home then in March, and I was there till September. And then from and then
GI Bill.
I was I went I was at Hatch, New Mexico. I came back home, and then I had the summer to do what I wanted. But then I applied for optometry school, and so I applied for the GI Bill of Rights. And then I got accepted into optometry school in Chicago. And so we we went, of course, it was 3 semesters to make up a year of college. Well, we went straight through the summer. So we made up 3 semesters in the summer. And that way we got 4 years in 3. And so we got out in September '49. I was graduated, and we looked around for a place to practice optometry, and I ended up in Wabasha, Minnesota. So I started out in January 1950, and I retired in February of 1998. And so I raised a family of 4. And in the Wabasha those years, and we had good years. So, and then of course I've been retired since '98, and of course that's been a very pleasant time of life. So that's about the whole story.
Ed, the question we have for you is when you raised your BAR up at that factory window, we call that a pucker factor moment. What was going through your mind when you pulled the trigger on your BAR? What was the first thought?
Well, the first thought, it wouldn't fire, so I realized that I could not be of use in that area anymore. And so the only thing to do is to get out of there. And so I went out the back way where I came in and across the river, and I got back to my company lines.
Well, that was pretty sharp right there. You skedaddled. You did your PT.
It was not a place to hang around.
I think upstairs you were talking to the youth about that night march where you marched 12 miles to go set up positions on the Motor River. What kind of language was used during that night march as you were talking to one another?
Well, yeah, there were a lot of guys falling down, so the language was not the best.
Did you learn any new words?
Right.
You didn't learn any new words.
Yeah.
Well, Ed, we're extremely proud of you, and we're very thankful and tickled that you could be with us here tonight. We just thank your daughter, Diane McMurray, for setting up the Zoom on your end, and we just appreciate your service. And Diane has also served at the VA for 38 years as a nurse. And so let's give them both a round of applause. Okay, folks, question and answer. So I'm going to invite, if we can bring the house lights up, I'm going to invite both authors to take their battle positions at the table. We have a question that's addressed to both of you. When Abe Bauman spoke at the round table, he highlighted how haphazard the planning was for the Hamelberg Raid. Did either author interview Abe or anyone else related to the raid?
When I was in the 37th Tank Regiment, I got assigned to do a history of the Hamelberg Raid. So I wrote about a 50-page paper in which I talked to people who were in the war but not on that raid, and people who had been with Third Army. One of them was one of the 4th Armored Division commanders. It's interesting to talk about the haphazard nature of it because it was. Third Army was headed towards Hamelberg, and then they got orders to divert and go in a different angle. So Patton realized that his army was as close as it was going to get to Hamelberg, and that's why he rushed to try to get somebody to make a diversion before they got too far separated. But as I explained, from a military point of view, it was inexcusable because he tried to do, and his instructions to bomb were divergent. They were diametrically opposed missions. A raid and a diversion, which are completely different. One's noisy, one's stealthy. It was the most inexcusable order I ever saw Patton give, and one that's hard to explain, except he let his emotions rule his military sense.
Can we use the British term of cocked up?
Yeah, the other thing too was that initially he wanted to send Creighton Abrams with his combat command, and Abrams wanted to take the entire combat command. Patton said no. It's also interesting that Bradley denied knowing anything about this, but his aide Chet Henson said, "Oh yeah, I was there when Patton briefed Bradley about it." And Bradley told Patton that you can do this as long as you don't get decisively engaged. and that instruction, don't get decisively engaged, apparently drove the decision to reduce the size of the raid from a full combat command to a small task force. And I think that instruction, the unwillingness to tell Patton not to do it, to allow him to do it, those are the things that, and the short timeline and truncated timeline, all played into this, to not sending a large enough force or even attempting the mission in the first place. It shouldn't have been done.
Very good. Joe, let's go to Joe.
If I can chime in, was the question, did any of you interview Abe? Did
Yeah.
you mean Abe Baum?
Abe Baum.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, the answer is yes. I spent a week with Abe and his family in 1985. I took him on a tour of all his old battlefields, and I personally got to know, during the writing of the screenplay, I got to know personally Bill Nutto, W.C. Henson, he was a tank driver, Norm Hoffner, Irv Solotov, Robert Zawada, Bob Thompson, Milt Koschel from Minnesota, Tony DeSanto, as well as Abe Baum. And it was a great privilege to get to know all these guys, either by email or by telephone or by knowing them personally and visiting them. And it was one of the great honors of my life.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Kelly. Jim, is there a movie available from the second author, Jim? Patton's Secret Mission, as mentioned.
I wish there was, and maybe someday there will be. It's not easy to find people who want to produce a movie that is such a downer in terms of our iconic hero. And people don't want to go to the movie. And I mean, I guess the Alamo has been made into movies, but normally we like happy endings, and this was not Patton's finest moment. And if anybody knows a producer, we're ready to go.
Okay, I'm going to go over to Steve. Steve, next question. Do you have one for
All right.
Kelly?
Yes, I have one for Kelly. Kelly, how do Patton's techniques compare with those of the German Blitzkrieg, or the German commanders?
Well, there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is the Blitzkrieg was never an official German doctrine.
Right.
Okay? The Blitzkrieg word was coined by Time magazine to describe the way they saw the German attacks in France and to Belgium and the Netherlands. And Robert Citino has written some very good books about this. The German march into France was actually done at the same rate that they, march into Poland was in the same rate that they had marched into France in World War I. You know, they were hamstrung by their faulty logistics systems, you know, how fast they could actually move. But there were a lot of similarities in mission orders. There were a lot of similarities in the development of combined arms columns. And not by accident, Patton studied Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and Clausewitz and others. He followed them. He followed Hans von Seeck, who became the chief of staff of the German army after World War I. The German army, as you know from World War I and Versailles, was restricted to 100,000 men. They had no tanks, etc. They realized, Hans von Seeck realized, they're still surrounded by the Russians and by the French, and huge armies. So how could they win? They decided that they'd have to do it by maneuver, by fast operating forces. And Patton agreed with them. He said, this is because this is what technology is evolving into, the way tanks can move and our wheeled vehicles, etc. He saw that idea of small professional, fast-moving columns as successful. A major difference was, though, the German plan was always to deliver a decisive battle. Break through at certain points and have pincer movements to come together to create the decisive battle. Patton believed in unbalancing the enemy through sustained shock. Critically here, though, Heinz Guderian believed the same thing. And when Guderian wrote Achtung Panzer in 1937, he explained the Knesselnacht, the cauldron battles, the pincing off and creating a battle. But when he executed the breakout through Ardennes in his attack on France, he was ordered 3 times by higher command to stop so that the infantry columns could catch up to his armor, and he refused. Hitler called him deliberately and said, "Stop," and Heinz Guderian refused. He kept going until he hit the British Channel, the English Channel. And his personal example is what created what we perceive as Blitzkrieg. Patton observed all that. He was down at Fort Benning reading all these reports and following the dispatches from intelligence. And Patton kept saying, "He's doing what I think should be done." So was he grafting his ideas from Guderian? No, but he saw a kindred soul as they were being executed.
Did Patton consider himself a reincarnation of Hamilcar Barca, the famed Carthaginian general?
Reincarnation of who?
Hamilcar Barca.
I'm sorry,
It's-
I don't know who
it's
that is. And I
Hannibal's
don't know if he
dad.
considered what he considered.
It's a tough one. I don't even think I could try this one myself.
It's too tough for me.
Yeah.
Swing and a miss.
Is anyone?
Barca for 200.
I have read where he considered himself to be a soldier at Zama, which is one of Hannibal's soldiers.
Yeah.
But not Hannibal
But
himself.
not
But
as
he considered
fun.
himself to be an incarnation of one of Napoleon's marshals, that he had been in one of Caesar's legions.
Right.
The question, I get asked this question a lot was, did he really believe it? Do you think he was reincarnated, et cetera? And I think that there is a level of familiarity with those stories from his youngest years. Before he could read, he was doing rote memorization of poems about these great commanders and their stories and lives and things. And I think that it was so imbued in his psyche that when he was, for example, coming out of Normandy, he'd go, well, Caesar used this road when he went to England, and he could consciously remember it so clearly that it was like he had been there. And I think that's important because there are analysts like John Semita who talk about the achieving synthetic experience. He says this is what Clausewitz was trying to get through in On War, was that Clausewitz faced a dilemma. He was the new superintendent of the War Academy in Prussia, but they were done with war. The Napoleonic Wars were over with, yet they're still surrounded by enemies. And Clausewitz said, the only way to be proficient at war is to be experienced in it. But how do you get experienced if you're not going to be fighting? And what he wanted to do was he wanted to create an base understanding of war and then have his students recreate the battles as if they were participating in them. Set up a battle, do a war game, and have the guys see it not as it occurred, but as it's unfolding, and ask them, what do you see? What decisions would you make? Why do you make those? And if you do that enough, the student would gain what he called synthetic experience. It's so imbued in you that you can call it. This is what Malcolm Gladwell talks about in the book Blink, that you study so much that you have an intuitive knowledge now based off of your learning. Patton wrote in the 1930s the same exact idea, that you must read the history as if you're a participant and do it enough to where you have felt like you've lived it. And I think that from an early age created his sense of deja vu, his sense of reincarnation.
If I could just add,
I just want to say, we need to retool that question for you. Instead of on DSM-5 on narcissism, maybe it's on reincarnationism. What do you think? Maybe it's a second volume to your award-winning book.
well, we'll get to work on that. But if I can just add one comment. There's an excellent biography written by Robert Patton, the grandson of the great general, and he says that his grandfather frequently looked, when he had a problem, when he looked to the past for answers, did not always serve him well.
Now, as we come to a close, I want to tell you something we worked with. The 3M Auditorium is of the highest scientific value. Your seats have been triggered to answer several of the questions through the presentation. So the first question on how you felt about George and how you felt about each of the authors presenting their case. Was he nuts or what? Was he a hot mess? Was he just absolutely a battlefield master? Well, the first question, military genius, your seats told us, ding, ding, ding. Yes, he was. Okay. Second question, was he mad? Was he a mad hatter, or was he just as crazy as a fruitcake? What was he? Ding, ding, ding. Again, you agreed on that. Third thing, radical combat commander. And, yep, your seats told us, ding-a-ling, ding-ding. Okay, so the last one, was he a narcissist? And survey says, ding-a-ling, ding-dong-ding. Yes, he was. Now, the one question that was kind of posed, but neither of our lecturers directly addressed during their speech was he a reincarnationist? Well, big question mark there. But the spirit in the room came up, and guess what? I'll be back. When will I be back? Okay, that was kind of my, I had some fun. Okay, so let's give our authors a round of applause and thanks.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.